Before the abdication that rocked an empire, there was a different love story, one that ended not with a king giving up his throne, but with a woman losing everything because of a single, trusting act of friendship. Her name was Thelma, Viscountess Furness, the beautiful, serene American who for 5 years was the center of the universe for Edward, Prince of Wales. She was his confidant, the mistress of his secret sanctuary, and the woman he called Toodles. She believed, as did much of London's society, that she was his destiny. And then she made one catastrophic mistake. Driven by a desperate call for help from her identical twin sister in America, Thelma had to leave the prince's side. In a moment of tragic foresight, she turned to a sharp-witted friend, another American named Wallis Simpson, and made a simple, fateful request. Look after the little man. See that he doesn't get into any trouble. That request didn't just cost Thelma a man. It cost her a crown and ignited the fuse on the greatest royal scandal of the 20th century. Her personal tragedy became a hinge of fate, an act of loyalty that inadvertently set the stage for Wallis Simpson's rise, King Edward VIII's abdication, and ultimately the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. The author Truman Capote once delivered a verdict on her life that was as poetic as it was pitiless. Thelma is proof that sometimes history is just a party to which you are not invited. Today we are pushing past the velvet ropes. We will tell the devastating story of the woman who came before Wallis, explore the fatal error that broke her, and confront the haunting question that has echoed for nearly a century. What if she had never boarded that ship? To truly comprehend the trajectory of Thelma Furness's life, you must first immerse yourself in the intoxicating, contradictory, and deeply wounded world that forged her ambitions. The 1920s, often remembered as the Roaring Twenties or the Jazz Age, was not simply an era of celebration. It was a decade of collective hysterical denial. Europe, and particularly Great Britain, was staggering out of the wreckage of the First World War, a conflict that had consumed a generation of its young men and shattered its old certainties. An estimated 750,000 British soldiers had been killed, leaving behind a nation of grieving mothers, widowed wives, and unmarried young women who were chillingly referred to as the surplus 2 million. This demographic catastrophe created a profound psychological shift. The rigid, stuffy, and deeply patriarchal Edwardian era was dead, buried in the mud of Passchendaele and the Somme. In its place rose a culture of almost violent modernity. For women, this was a moment of unprecedented, if terrifying, freedom. They had worked in factories and on farms during the war, tasting economic and social independence for the first time. They bobbed their hair, shortened their skirts, smoked in public, and danced the Charleston with a desperate, almost nihilistic glee. Theirs was a world where tradition had led to slaughter, and the future was a terrifying blank. The only sane response, it seemed, was to live entirely and dangerously in the present. For the British aristocracy, the war was an existential blow. While they had led the charge, their class had also paid a terrible price. Great ancestral homes that had stood for centuries were now silent, their young heirs lying in graves across Flanders. The fortunes that had sustained this world of inherited privilege were crippled by death duties and a changing economic landscape. These dukes, marquises, and earls still possessed their ancient titles and their sprawling, drafty estates, but many were perilously close to bankruptcy. They were lords of dwindling manors, kings of crumbling castles, clinging to a social order that was rapidly becoming obsolete. Into this vacuum of men and money sailed a new and powerful force, the American heiress. These women, often dubbed dollar princesses, were the daughters of a different kind of aristocracy, the brazen, self-made titans of American industry, banking, and railroads. They were women like Consuelo Vanderbilt, who had been famously forced by her ambitious mother, Alva, to marry the 9th Duke of Marlborough in 1895, her vast dowry effectively saving the magnificent but financially hemorrhaging Blenheim Palace. By the 1920s, this transatlantic exchange had become a sophisticated, if unstated, social contract. American new money was traded for British old titles. These American girls were a revelation in the stuffy drawing rooms of Mayfair and the formal weekend parties of the English countryside. They were confident, outspoken, and possessed a vibrant, unself-conscious energy that the more reserved English found both shocking and utterly captivating. They were not weighed down by centuries of tradition or the collective trauma of the Great War. They were creatures of the future, symbols of a new world order where wealth and charisma were beginning to eclipse lineage and land. They were hungry for a history they didn't possess, and the British aristocracy was hungry for a future they could no longer afford. It was a perfect and often perilous transaction of needs. This was the marketplace of glamour and desperation that Thelma Morgan and her identical twin sister Gloria were about to enter, armed with little more than their otherworldly beauty and a will to conquer forged in the crucible of their own strange and rootless childhood. Presiding over this glittering, fractured world was a single, incandescent figure, Edward, Prince of Wales. To the public, he was Prince Charming made real. He was the most famous and photographed man on the planet, a global superstar whose every move, every romance, every sartorial choice was headline news. His charm was legendary, his energy seemingly boundless. He traveled the globe as the empire's greatest ambassador, and wherever he went, he was met with a kind of hysterical adoration that wouldn't be seen again until the advent of rock and roll. But the public persona was a masterfully constructed illusion, a mask that concealed a deeply troubled and profoundly lonely man. Known to his family and friends as David, the prince was a paradox. He was the heir to the most powerful throne in the world, yet he felt like a prisoner. His relationship with his father, the formidable and deeply conservative King George V, was one of mutual incomprehension and constant friction. The king despaired of his son's modern ways, his flashy clothes, his love of jazz, his preference for the company of racy socialites over staid courtiers. He famously and prophetically said, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself in 12 months. His mother, the regal and emotionally remote Queen Mary, offered little in the way of maternal warmth. David was raised in a world of rigid protocol and emotional austerity, a world where duty was everything and personal happiness was a frivolous, almost vulgar consideration. He grew to resent the very institution he was born to lead. He craved normalcy, intimacy, and the kind of unconditional affection that his royal upbringing had denied him. This profound emotional neediness was the driving force of his life, the fatal flaw that would ultimately lead him to abdicate his throne. He found a temporary cure for his loneliness in the arms of married women. They offered him the maternal affection he craved without the constitutional complexities and dynastic pressures of marrying a suitable virginal royal bride. For over a decade before he met Thelma, his life had been anchored by his relationship with Frida Dudley Ward, the beautiful and vivacious wife of a member of Parliament. Frida was more than a mistress. She was his confidant, his therapist, his emotional bedrock. He wrote her thousands of deeply intimate, almost childish letters, pouring out his anxieties and his frustrations with his role. She was the safe harbor in the storm of his public life. But by the late 1920s, the prince, now in his 30s, was growing restless. His relationship with Frida had become comfortable, almost domestic, and he was beginning to crave a new kind of excitement. He was the golden prince of the jazz age, and he was hungry for a love that was as modern, as glamorous, and as thrilling as the era itself. The stage was perfectly set for a new leading lady, someone who could match the glamour of the moment, someone who was untethered to the stuffy English establishment he so resented. He was waiting for an American beauty, and Thelma Morgan was about to arrive. Thelma Converse Morgan and her identical twin Gloria were not born to the vast dynastic wealth of a Vanderbilt or an Astor, but their origins were, in their own way, just as extraordinary and far more cosmopolitan. They were born on August 23rd, 1904, in a hotel in Lucerne, Switzerland, into a world of transit lounges, diplomatic postings, and borrowed grandeur. Their father, Harry Hayes Morgan, was an American diplomat of some social standing but little actual fortune. He was a charming, handsome man who held a series of consular posts in cities like Brussels, Berlin, and Buenos Aires. He was, by all accounts, a pleasant but somewhat ineffectual figure, a man who enjoyed the perks of diplomatic life more than the work itself. The true engine of the Morgan family was their mother, Laura Kilpatrick Morgan. Laura was a formidable character, a woman of iron will and relentless social ambition. The daughter of a Union Army general and diplomat, she had inherited a certain worldliness and a keen understanding of the mechanics of power. She was also part Chilean, a fact that gave her and her daughters a hint of exoticism that was highly prized in the blonder, paler world of Anglo-Saxon society. Laura knew from the moment her identical twin daughters were born that they were her masterpieces, her tickets to the highest echelons of the world she so desperately wanted to conquer. She saw their breathtaking beauty not as a gift, but as a strategic asset, a key that could unlock any door. The girls' childhood was a blur of languages, countries, and governesses. They never had a true home, living instead in a succession of rented villas and grand hotels. They were raised not as American girls, but as citizens of an international elite. Their education was not focused on academics, but on the far more important arts of society. How to dress, how to flirt, how to make charming conversation in 4 languages, and, most importantly, how to captivate and marry a powerful and wealthy man. An acquaintance from this period recalled that Laura Morgan ran her family like a military campaign, and her daughters were her beautiful, perfectly trained shock troops. This rootless, high-pressure upbringing forged an almost unnaturally intense bond between the twins. They were more than sisters. They were allies, confidants, and reflections of one another. In a world of constant change and uncertainty, they were each other's only constant. They developed their own secret language, their own private universe. Thelma was generally seen as the more grounded and introverted of the two, the quiet strategist, while Gloria was the sparkling, impulsive, and often reckless star. But they functioned as a single, devastatingly effective unit. They were the magnificent Morgans, and society was their stage. Their campaign began when they were just teenagers. At a party in New York, the 16-year-old Gloria was introduced to Reginald Reggie Claypool Vanderbilt, the 42-year-old heir to the vast New York Central Railroad fortune. Reggie was a notorious figure, a hard-drinking, gambling bon vivant who had already burned through a significant portion of his inheritance. But he was a Vanderbilt, and for Laura Morgan that was all that mattered. After a whirlwind courtship, they were married in 1923. A year later, Gloria gave birth to a daughter, Gloria Laura Vanderbilt, who would one day become a famous artist, designer, and a celebrity in her own right. The Morgan family had secured their first beachhead in the fortress of American high society. Thelma's first foray into matrimony was less spectacular, but equally strategic. At 17, she married James Vale Converse, a handsome grandson of the president of the American Bell Telephone Company. He was older, charming, and socially well-connected. The marriage, however, was a youthful mistake. Thelma quickly realized that Jimmy Converse was not the powerful figure she had imagined, and the life he offered was not grand enough to satisfy her ambitions. The marriage was annulled after a few short years, a minor skirmish in the larger campaign. It served its purpose. It had launched Thelma into society and given her the experience and polish she would need for her next, far more significant conquest. Tragedy soon struck the family, a blow that would have profound consequences for the rest of their lives. In 1925, just a year and a half after his daughter's birth, Reggie Vanderbilt died suddenly from cirrhosis of the liver, a result of his lifelong alcoholism. At the age of 20, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt was a widow, a mother, and the trustee of a $2.5 million trust fund for her infant daughter. She was fabulously wealthy, but she was also young, inexperienced, and utterly adrift. From that moment on, Thelma and Gloria clung to each other even more tightly. Gloria's immense fortune allowed the two sisters to live a life of incredible luxury, flitting between Paris, London, and New York. They were at the center of the smart set, famous for their beauty, their style, and their lavish parties. But beneath the glittering surface, their position was precarious. Gloria's wealth was tied to her daughter, and the powerful Vanderbilt family watched her every move with deep suspicion. The sisters knew that their glamorous lifestyle depended entirely on their ability to maintain their social standing, and for Thelma to finally make the spectacular marriage that had thus far eluded her. Her gaze and her mother's now turned decisively across the Atlantic to the ancient titles and unparalleled prestige of the British aristocracy. The ultimate prize was there, and Thelma was ready to claim it. When Thelma Morgan, now a divorcee in her early 20s, and her newly widowed twin sister Gloria descended upon London in the mid-1920s, they were not arriving as hopeful debutantes. They were arriving as seasoned campaigners. Their nomadic childhood and their mother's relentless social coaching had been their West Point. New York society had been their dress rehearsal. London was to be their coronation. Armed with Gloria's Vanderbilt fortune and their own breathtaking, almost unsettlingly identical beauty, they were perfectly equipped to conquer the one society that still mattered above all others. But London society in the Jazz Age was a complex and treacherous ecosystem. It was not a world you could simply buy your way into. It was a labyrinth of ancient families, unspoken codes, and powerful, formidable gatekeepers. These were the great political and social hostesses of the era, women like the ferociously intelligent Emerald Cunard and the relentlessly ambitious Sybil Colfax, whose invitations could make or break a reputation. To be excluded from their drawing rooms was to be a social non-entity. These women, the unofficial arbiters of English society, looked upon the influx of rich, vivacious Americans with a mixture of amusement, disdain, and pragmatic necessity. The Americans were often considered brash, loud, and hopelessly lacking in subtlety, but their energy, and more importantly, their money, were undeniable assets in a post-war world. The Morgan twins, however, were a different breed. They were not the boisterous, unsophisticated heiresses of popular caricature. Their European upbringing had given them a Polish and a continental flair that set them apart. They were exotic, yet they understood the nuances of the European elite. They moved through this rarefied world with a quiet, confident grace that was both alluring and slightly mysterious. They were an immediate sensation. The famous photographer Cecil Beaton, the supreme chronicler of the era's beauty, was utterly mesmerized by them. He dubbed them the Celestial Twins and wrote of their startling, poignant beauty, describing their dark eyes, alabaster skin, and lips like wet peonies. He photographed them endlessly, turning their faces into icons of jazz-age glamour. They were sought after, talked about, and admired. They had breached the outer walls of the fortress. But for Thelma, this was not enough. To secure her position permanently, she needed a title. She needed a British husband. She found him in the form of Marmaduke Furness, 1st Viscount Furness. Known to everyone as Duke, he was the chairman of the Furness Withy Shipping Company, one of the largest and most powerful maritime operations in the world. He was quite simply one of the richest men in the British Empire. Born in 1883, he was 21 years, Thelma's senior, a man of a different generation, a different temperament, a different world. Where the society around him was frivolous and fast-paced, Duke Furness was solid, industrious, and deeply serious. He had built a global empire through hard work and shrewd business acumen, and he carried himself with the quiet, unshakable confidence of a man who knows his own worth in tonnage and trade. He was not a dashingly handsome or a sparklingly witty man. He was a widower with children, a man approaching middle age who preferred the boardroom and the racetrack to the frenetic nightclubs of Mayfair. But he was utterly captivated by Thelma. To him, this young American beauty, with her quiet elegance and gentle voice, represented a world of glamour and sophistication far removed from the shipyards and ledgers that had defined his life. And for Thelma, Duke offered the Holy Grail, a title, immense wealth, and an unassailable position at the very pinnacle of the British aristocracy. It was a perfect match of her beauty and his power. Their courtship was swift, and their marriage in 1926 was a major society event. Thelma Morgan, the American diplomat's daughter, became Thelma, Viscountess Furness. She was now the mistress of a vast fortune and several magnificent homes, including Borough Court, a sprawling country estate in Leicestershire, and a grand London residence in Carlton House Terrace. She had done it. She had fulfilled the destiny her mother had mapped out for her since birth. She was no longer a guest in this exclusive world. She was one of its hostesses. Her position was secure, her future seemingly guaranteed. She had a kind, powerful, if somewhat unexciting husband. She had everything a woman of her time and ambition could possibly dream of, but her heart and her destiny had another appointment to keep. The marriage to Duke Furness was not the final act of her story. It was the essential, beautifully decorated stage upon which the great drama of her life was about to unfold. Life as Lady Furness was a whirlwind of social obligations. She hosted lavish weekend parties at Borough Court, attended by the cream of British society. It was in Leicestershire, the heart of England's fox-hunting country, that she first entered the orbit of the Prince of Wales. The Prince's set, the fast-living, pleasure-seeking group known as the Marlborough House set, were frequent visitors to the area. It was a world of hard riding, hard drinking, and intricate affairs. Thelma, as the beautiful young wife of a powerful but often absent older man, was a natural object of fascination. She was on the periphery of the prince's circle, but she had not yet met the man himself in any meaningful way. That all changed at a mundane, almost comically provincial event that would alter the course of her life, and in some ways, the course of the British monarchy itself. The meeting did not happen in a glittering London ballroom or at a sophisticated Parisian supper club. It happened, of all places, at the Leicestershire Agricultural Show in 1929. Thelma was there with her husband, Duke, a prominent local landowner. The Prince of Wales was there in his official capacity, dutifully inspecting prize-winning pigs and handing out trophies. In the formal receiving line, Thelma was presented to His Royal Highness. It was a fleeting formal moment, but something ignited. The prince was immediately struck by her. Later that day he sought her out, and they fell into a long and easy conversation. He was completely enchanted. Here was a woman who possessed the American confidence he found so alluring, but it was tempered with a gentle sweetness, a quiet serenity that he found deeply soothing. She was not loud or demanding like some of the other society women who vied for his attention. There was a calmness about her, a warmth that seemed to promise a refuge from the pressures of his life. For Thelma, the attraction was just as powerful. Here was the most famous and desirable man in the world, and he was looking at her with an expression of undisguised adoration. It was the moment every ambition, every dream, every carefully laid plan of her life had been leading towards. The affair did not begin overnight. It was a slow, deliberate courtship, conducted through discreet phone calls and carefully arranged meetings. The prince began to make excuses to visit the Furness estate. A casual drop-in for tea, a tour of the stables. Duke Furness, for his part, seemed either oblivious or, more likely, chose to be. Having the Prince of Wales as a frequent visitor was a sign of immense social prestige. In the moral landscape of the 1920s, aristocracy, a wife's discreet affair with royalty, was often seen not as a betrayal, but as a social triumph for the husband. The true casualty of this new romance was Frida Dudley Ward. For over a decade, she had been the prince's anchor. Their relationship was a cornerstone of London society, an accepted and understood fact of life. Its end was swift and shockingly brutal, a chilling dress rehearsal for the way the prince would later discard Thelma herself. One day, Frida placed her usual daily call to the prince at St. James's Palace. The palace switchboard operator, who for years had immediately put her through, came on the line with a cold, formal message. "I have orders not to put you through." Frida, stunned, assumed it was a mistake. She tried again. The same message was repeated. She never spoke to him again. After more than 10 years of devotion, she was erased from his life with a single, second-hand command. Thelma, Lady Furness, had taken her place. She was now the official, albeit undeclared, mistress of the heir to the British throne. To be the prince's chosen woman was to be given the keys to his secret kingdom, Fort Belvedere. The fort, a mock Gothic folly in Windsor Great Park, was more than a house. It was the physical embodiment of the prince's rebellion against the suffocating formality of his father's court. At Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, life was governed by centuries of rigid protocol. But at the fort, David could be himself. He could wear casual clothes, dig in his beloved gardens until his hands were dirty, mix his own cocktails, and listen to the latest jazz records on the gramophone. It was his sanctuary, his escape, his one true home, and Thelma became its undisputed queen. She was no longer just a weekend guest. She became the fort's unofficial chatelaine. The prince deferred to her taste in everything. She softened the house's masculine edges, helping him choose chintz fabrics for the sofas, ordering new curtains, and filling the rooms with flowers. These were not the actions of a temporary guest. This was the work of a woman nesting, of a woman creating a shared home. She was imprinting her identity onto the prince's most personal space, and he welcomed it. He adored her calming presence, her impeccable taste. He gave her the deeply affectionate, almost childish pet name, Toodles, a name that spoke of a comfortable, playful intimacy far removed from the stiff titles of the court. The weekends at the fort became the most sought-after invitation in the English-speaking world. Thelma presided as the perfect hostess, greeting a dizzying array of guests, aristocrats like their close friends, the Mountbattens, political figures, and international celebrities. It was a world of effortless glamour. Afternoons were for golf or gardening, and evenings began with potent American-style cocktails, a scandalous novelty in traditional English homes. Dinner was a relaxed affair, filled with laughter and gossip, often ending with the prince playing his bagpipes on the battlements before the whole party settled in to watch the latest films from Hollywood, which were flown in specially for him. In this idyllic setting, Thelma truly believed she had won. Her husband, Duke, was a frequent traveler, often away for months at a time on business. His absences made the affair easy to conduct and allowed Thelma to devote herself completely to the prince. She was living the life of a de facto princess. She traveled with him on holidays to the fashionable resorts of Biarritz and Cannes, her presence noted and accepted by everyone. She was his consort in all but name. A courtier of the time observed, Lady Furness carried herself with a serene confidence. She was never pushy or loud. She simply behaved in all respects as if she were already his wife, and for a time, we all believed she would be. She had the prince's heart, she was the mistress of his home, and she saw no rivals on the horizon. But a shadow was beginning to fall across their perfect sun-drenched garden, and it belonged to a woman Thelma considered her friend. Wallis Simpson was, like Thelma, a married American woman trying to make her mark in London. But there, the similarities ended. Where Thelma was softly beautiful and serenely charming, Wallis was razor sharp. She was not a classic beauty. Her appeal lay in her wit, her intelligence, and a certain hard-won cynical wisdom. She had been through one divorce already and was now in her second marriage to Ernest Simpson, a quiet, scholarly, and successful shipping executive. Wallis was fiercely ambitious, a brilliant conversationalist, and a woman who had honed the art of pleasing powerful men to a razor's edge. Thelma moved in the same American expatriate circles as the Simpsons, and the two women struck up a friendship. It was Thelma who, in a gesture she would regret for the rest of her life, first invited Wallis and Ernest to her country home, Borough Court, for a weekend party on January 10th, 1931. The Prince of Wales was the guest of honor. This was the first time Wallis Simpson met her future king. The initial meeting was unremarkable. The prince was polite, but paid her little special attention. His focus was entirely on Thelma. Wallis, for her part, was reportedly unimpressed, finding him less charismatic than she had expected. But Wallis was a patient and brilliant strategist. She and Ernest were soon invited to other parties, hosted by Thelma, and then, crucially, to the inner sanctum of Fort Belvedere. Slowly, carefully, Wallis began to cultivate a unique relationship with the prince. She was not like the other women in his circle, who treated him with a breathless, fawning deference. Wallis was irreverent. She teased him, engaged him in witty, sometimes risque banter, and treated him not as a future monarch, but as a man. She developed a series of amusing, American-style phrases and inside jokes that delighted him. She showed a keen interest in his official papers and the political issues of the day, something Thelma had never done. She was positioning herself not as a romantic rival, but as an indispensable friend, a court jester with a brilliant mind. Thelma saw none of it as a threat. On the contrary, she was pleased. Wallis was amusing, and she kept the prince entertained. Thelma saw Wallis's growing closeness to the prince as a reflection of her own secure position. She was the sun, and Wallis was merely a minor planet allowed into her orbit. In her own memoir, Thelma wrote of this period with a heartbreaking lack of foresight. I looked upon Wallis as a boon companion. She was gay, she was witty. She had the gift of putting the prince in a good mood. Thelma, secure in her love, failed to see that Wallis was not offering the prince simple amusement. She was offering him an intoxicating cocktail of intellectual stimulation and subtle dominance that he was beginning to find irresistible. The friendship between the two women was a facade, a polite fiction masking a ruthless campaign. The serpent was not just in the garden. She had been invited in, given a seat at the table, and was slowly, silently preparing to strike. In the golden autumn of 1934, Thelma Viscountess Furness stood at the absolute zenith of her life. She was the beloved companion of the Prince of Wales, the celebrated hostess of his private court, and a woman who confidently believed she was on the verge of becoming the future Queen of England. Her world was a carefully constructed paradise of love, influence, and glamour. But paradise is a fragile thing. Sometimes all it takes to shatter it is a single frantic summons from an ocean away, a call to duty that duty's greatest rival, destiny, will use to its own devastating advantage. While Thelma reigned supreme in her English garden, a storm of almost unimaginable ferocity was gathering around her twin sister in New York, a storm that would ultimately reach across the Atlantic and pull Thelma down with it. The scandal that would become the catalyst for Thelma's downfall was the infamous custody trial for her 10-year-old niece, Gloria Vanderbilt, known to the world as Little Gloria. On the surface, it was a battle for a child. In reality, it was a brutal war between two worlds, two moralities, and two immensely powerful families. Following the death of her husband Reggie, Thelma's sister Gloria had been living a glamorous, bohemian, and utterly unsupervised life, flitting between Paris, London, and New York with her daughter in tow. She was the quintessential jazz-age mother, beautiful, indulgent, and often absent. This lifestyle was anathema to the powerful Vanderbilt clan, particularly to Reggie's sister, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. Gertrude was a renowned sculptor and the founder of the Whitney Museum of American Art. She was the matriarch of the family, a woman of immense wealth, iron will, and deeply conservative values. She looked upon her sister-in-law's chaotic, globe-trotting existence with profound disapproval and believed that young Gloria was being raised in a morally bankrupt environment, neglected by a mother who was more interested in parties and lovers than in parenting. In the summer of 1934, Gertrude sued for custody. The trial that ensued was not just a family dispute. It was one of the most sensational legal battles of the 20th century. It became known as the trial of the century, a sordid public spectacle that laid bare the most intimate secrets of the super-rich. The Vanderbilt lawyers, backed by a seemingly limitless war chest, launched a vicious and systematic character assassination of Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt. They portrayed her as an unfit mother, a spendthrift who was squandering her daughter's inheritance on a decadent lifestyle. They called witnesses, disgruntled former maids, governesses, and chauffeurs who testified to wild parties, late nights, and a revolving door of male companions. The accusations grew darker and more scandalous. Gloria was accused of having an affair with a married German prince, but the most explosive charge, the one designed to utterly destroy her reputation in the puritanical climate of 1930s America, was the accusation of lesbianism. A former maid testified that she had seen Gloria in a romantic embrace with Nadezhda de Torby, the Marchioness of Milford Haven, a member of the extended British royal family. In an era when homosexuality was considered a perverse and criminal aberration, this accusation was radioactive. The press went into a frenzy. The trial was no longer about a child's welfare. It was a modern-day witch hunt, and Gloria was tied to the stake. In her Paris apartment, Gloria collapsed. She was ill-prepared for the sheer brutality of the Vanderbilt machine. She was terrified, alone, and on the verge of a complete nervous breakdown. She needed the one person in the world she could always count on, her other half, her twin. She sent a desperate cable to Thelma in London. The message was simple: "Come, I need you." For Thelma, there was no choice. This was not just her sister. It was her mirror image, her soulmate. To abandon Gloria in her darkest hour was unthinkable. But to go to her, she would have to leave the prince. She would have to leave her kingdom unattended at the most dangerous possible moment. Thelma broke the news to the prince over a long, somber lunch. He was distraught. He was a man who craved constant reassurance, who hated being alone, and Thelma had become the center of his emotional universe. The thought of her being gone for weeks, perhaps even months, plunged him into a state of boyish anxiety. "What will I do without you?" he asked, his famous charm replaced by a raw vulnerability. "The fort won't be the same. I won't be the same." He pleaded with her not to go, to let the lawyers handle it. But he didn't understand. For Thelma, this was a matter of blood, a sacred duty to the one person who shared her face, her history, her very soul. She reassured him that she would be back as soon as she could. She would write every day. She would call. It would only be for a little while. But his loneliness was palpable. And in that moment, Thelma made a decision, a seemingly small and considerate gesture of friendship that would prove to be the single most catastrophic mistake of her life. Her thoughts turned to her amusing American friend, Wallis Simpson. Wallis was fun. She was a brilliant conversationalist, and she knew how to handle the prince's moods. It was the perfect solution. A few days before she was due to sail, Thelma hosted a small farewell gathering. Wallis was there, of course, a picture of sympathetic friendship. Taking her aside, Thelma relayed the prince's anxieties. Her words, which she would later record in her memoir, and which have since become legendary for their tragic irony, were spoken with the innocent sincerity of a woman who believes she is surrounded by friends. "Oh, Wallis, the little man is going to be so lonely," Thelma said, a worried frown on her face. "Why don't you and Ernest see that he's amused? Do look after him." Imagine the scene. Thelma, her mind already an ocean away, consumed with worry for her besieged sister, placing her own fragile happiness into the hands of her friend. And Wallis, her sharp, intelligent eyes meeting Thelma's, her face a perfect mask of concern, promising that she would do just that. "Of course, darling," one can imagine her saying. "Don't you worry about a thing. We'll take wonderful care of him." It was a transaction made in the language of friendship, but it was in reality a fatal abdication of power. Thelma was not just asking a friend to entertain a lonely prince. She was unknowingly appointing her own successor. She walked up the gangplank of the ocean liner, waving goodbye to the man she loved, convinced she was leaving him in safe hands. What followed was a tale of two cities, a brutal counterpoint of misery and conquest. In New York, Thelma was plunged into the hell of the custody trial. The courtroom was a theater of cruelty. She and her sister were subjected to days of relentless, humiliating cross-examination. Their entire lives were picked apart, their morals questioned, their every expenditure and friendship presented as evidence of their decadence. Thelma's own affair with the Prince of Wales was a constant, unspoken presence in the room, a source of salacious speculation for the press and a weapon for the Vanderbilt lawyers, who used it to paint the Morgan sisters as amoral adventuresses. Thelma put on a brave face for her sister, but the strain was immense. She was fighting for her family's honor in a dirty exhausting and all-consuming war. Meanwhile, back in London, Wallis Simpson was not merely looking after the prince. She was executing a masterful and audacious coup. She did not make the mistake of trying to be a substitute for Thelma. She knew she could not compete with Thelma's gentle beauty. Instead, she offered the prince something entirely new, something he hadn't even known he was craving. She became not his adoring companion, but his indispensable manager. She took over the running of Fort Belvedere with an iron efficiency, organizing his menus, managing his staff, and creating a perfectly ordered world around him. More importantly, she engaged him on an intellectual and psychological level that Thelma never had. She would sit with him for hours as he worked on his official state papers, offering shrewd advice and unwavering support, and she perfected her unique brand of intimate dominance. She famously told him, "You may be the Prince of Wales, but you are still just a man." She would scold him for his poor eating habits, critique his clothes, and treat him with a mixture of maternal care and flirtatious command that he found utterly intoxicating. For a man who had been suffocated by a lifetime of deference, Wallis's impertinence was the ultimate aphrodisiac. He wasn't just falling in love, he was becoming completely and utterly dependent on her. Thelma, preoccupied in New York, began to feel the earth shifting beneath her feet. The prince's daily letters became less frequent, their tone shifting from passionate and loving to something cooler, more perfunctory. His phone calls grew shorter. He seemed distracted, distant. Then a chilling letter arrived from her friend, the society hostess Consuelo Thaw. It contained a friendly but urgent warning. "I think Wallis is making a great play for the prince," Consuelo wrote. "She is with him constantly. The little man seems to be completely under her spell." A cold dread began to seep into Thelma's heart. The trial was finally over, and Gloria had lost. Custody of little Gloria was awarded to her aunt, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. It was a devastating defeat. Bruised, exhausted, and now deeply anxious about her own life, Thelma booked the first available passage back to England. She sent a cable to the prince, informing him of her arrival time. His reply was a single ominously brief sentence, confirming he would meet the boat. The 5-day voyage across the wintry Atlantic must have been the longest journey of her life, a slow, agonizing passage through a sea of uncertainty and fear. He was there, as promised, standing on the quay, but from the moment she saw him, she knew it was over. The man waiting for her was a stranger. The joyful, boyish enthusiasm that had always marked their reunions was gone, replaced by a stiff, formal courtesy. He pecked her on the cheek, a cold, passionless gesture that felt more like a dismissal than a welcome. The easy, intimate chatter that had always filled their car rides was replaced by an awkward, almost unbearable silence. She tried to tell him about the horrors of the trial, about her worries for Gloria, but he seemed utterly uninterested, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He made polite, meaningless inquiries about her trip, the kind of conversation one has with a distant acquaintance. She later wrote of that drive, "The silence between us was as thick and as palpable as a London fog. I knew in that moment that I had lost him." He drove her to her house in London, not to their shared sanctuary, at the fort. As he dropped her off at her door, he said he would call her in a few days. He was busy. There were things he had to attend to. It was a transparently flimsy excuse. Thelma walked into her empty house, and the silence that greeted her was the sound of her world collapsing. The days that followed were a slow-motion torture. He did not call. Invitations to parties and weekend gatherings, which had once flooded her mailbox, stopped. When she tried to telephone him, the palace operators were suddenly unable to put her through. It was the same brutal, silent excommunication that he had inflicted upon Freda Dudley Ward years before. He was too cowardly to face her, to offer an explanation or an apology. He simply erased her. The London society that had once courted and celebrated her now turned a cold shoulder. Wallis Simpson was the new sun, and no one wanted to be caught in the shadow of the old, eclipsed one. The final, definitive blow came via a royal messenger, a small crisp envelope with the prince's crest. Inside was not a letter but a curt, formal note. He wished her well, always, but their relationship was at an end. There was no explanation, no remorse. It was a bureaucratic termination of a human heart. And just to twist the knife, he had also sent a second messenger to her jeweler, demanding the return of the various gifts and trinkets he had given her over the years. It was an act of breathtaking cruelty, a final public humiliation designed to strip her of any last vestige of their shared history. The dream was not just over, it was being systematically dismantled and repossessed. Thelma was left alone in the wreckage, a pariah in the very world she had so brilliantly conquered, haunted by the ghost of a single, kind, and catastrophically foolish request made to a friend. For a person who has lost everything, the world does not stop. It continues on, often with a cruel and spectacular indifference to their private grief. For Thelma Furness, shattered and exiled from the life she had built, the 2 years following her dismissal were a masterclass in public humiliation. She was forced to watch from the loneliest of sidelines as the affair that had begun in secret under her own roof blossomed into the greatest royal scandal of the modern age. Every newspaper she opened, every newsreel she watched was a fresh torment, a public reminder of her own private ruin. The man who had erased her with a cold formal note was now threatening to tear down 1,000-year-old monarchy for the very woman who had taken her place. Thelma was not just a spectator to history, she was its first forgotten casualty. On December 10, 1936, King Edward VIII, who had been on the throne for less than a year, signed the instrument of abdication. The next night, he addressed the world, his voice filled with a strange mixture of resolve and sadness, speaking the immortal words, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." That woman, Wallis Simpson, now waiting in self-imposed exile in the south of France, had won. She had not become a queen, but she had brought a king to his knees, compelling him to give up an empire for her. For Thelma, listening to that broadcast must have been a surreal and exquisitely painful experience. What does it feel like to watch the man you still love detonate his own life for the friend who betrayed you? The emotions must have been a tangled, contradictory mess. There must have been a strange, bitter sense of vindication. She, more than anyone, knew the hypnotic power of his obsessions. The world was now seeing the same single-minded, ruthless devotion that had once been focused on her, and had then been turned with equal totality to Wallis. Perhaps for a fleeting moment, the world's shock validated her own private agony, but beneath any vindication must have laid the deep, unanswerable, and haunting question that would follow her for the rest of her days. Would he have done that for me? If she had never taken that fateful trip to New York, if Wallis had never been given the opportunity to work her magic, if Thelma had been the one to face the constitutional crisis of marrying a divorced American commoner, would he have given up the throne for her? The overwhelming consensus of historians, courtiers, and those who knew the prince best is a gentle but firm no. His relationship with Thelma was a deep and genuine romance. He adored her, he was comfortable with her, he loved her. But his relationship with Wallis was something else entirely. It was a psychological obsession, a folie à deux of breathtaking intensity. Wallis's sharp, almost masculine dominance, her maternal scolding, and her intellectual engagement fulfilled a complex and deep-seated need in his psyche that Thelma's softer, more adoring love could not. Edward did not need a queen. He needed a governess, a manager, a witty and commanding partner who could order his chaotic inner world. Thelma offered him a tranquil harbor, but Wallis offered him the thrilling, terrifying storm he secretly craved. The tragedy for Thelma was not that she wasn't good enough, but simply that she was not the precise, unique cure for the king's specific, unique disease. And watching the abdication unfold, she must have finally and brutally understood that. After the abdication, the world moved on. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor, as Edward and Wallis became known, settled into a life of glamorous, rootless exile, becoming international curiosities. For Thelma, the path forward was far less clear. Her name was now forever linked to a painful and public scandal. She was no longer a major player but a historical footnote. The rest of her life would be a long, quiet, and often difficult search for the security and happiness that had been so dramatically snatched from her. Her divorce from Duke Furness was finalized, and with it went the title, the great houses, and the immense financial security she had once enjoyed. While she received a settlement, it was not enough to sustain the lavish lifestyle to which she had become accustomed. For the rest of their lives, she and her sister Gloria would be plagued by a genteel but persistent lack of funds, a constant struggle to maintain the appearances of wealth on ever-dwindling resources. It was a quiet, private humiliation for women who had once been among the richest and most celebrated in the world. For a time, it seemed she might recapture the magic. She began a passionate, high-profile affair with Prince Ali Khan, the son of the Aga Khan, spiritual leader of millions of Ismaili Muslims. Ali Khan was a legendary figure in his own right, a fabulously wealthy, impossibly handsome, and notoriously promiscuous playboy, diplomat, and racehorse owner. He was in many ways the heir to the Prince of Wales's throne as the world's most glamorous bachelor. Their affair was a whirlwind of racetracks, casinos, and Parisian nightclubs. For a moment, Thelma was back in the headlines, once again the companion of a world-famous prince. But Ali Khan was not a man who could be tamed. His affections were notoriously fleeting, and their relationship eventually fizzled out. He would later go on to marry the Hollywood superstar Rita Hayworth. For Thelma, it was another painful reminder that she was destined to be a consort, but never a wife. Her most enduring and important role in these years was that of a mother. From her marriage to Duke Furness, she had one son, William Anthony Tony Furness. In him, she found a private purpose far removed from the glare of society. Friends from this period recall her as a deeply devoted and loving mother, fiercely protective of her son and determined to give him a more stable life than the one she had known. And through it all, there was Gloria. The twinship that had defined their lives from birth became their ultimate refuge in the long twilight of their fame. They were a fixed point in each other's shifting worlds. They lived together for long periods, in New York and in California, two aging, still beautiful women sharing memories and propping each other up against the disappointments of life. In 1958, they co-wrote a memoir, Double Trouble, a title that perfectly captured the blend of glamour and chaos that had defined their lives. The book is a fascinating read, a light, frothy, and often wickedly funny account of their adventures. But it is most notable for what it leaves unsaid. The deepest heartbreaks, the brutal custody trial, the prince's cold dismissal, are skated over with a practiced, almost professional grace. It is the ultimate performance of the stiff upper lip, a story told by two women who had learned, the hard way, that some wounds are too deep to ever be exposed to the light. As Thelma and Gloria were settling into their quiet, shared obscurity, a new social chronicler was rising, a man who would document the lives of the mid-century's elite with an intimacy and a cruelty that made the gossip columnists of the 1930s look like amateurs. This was Truman Capote. Capote was fascinated by what he called his swans, the impossibly chic, wealthy, and often tragic society women who became his closest friends, and ultimately the subjects of his brilliant, unfinished novel, Answered Prayers. Capote was a connoisseur of faded glamour, of beauty past its peak, of lives defined by spectacular rises and even more spectacular falls. Thelma Furness, a relic from a slightly earlier pre-war era of glamour, was a perfect subject for his sharp, analytical gaze. He saw in her not just a woman, but a symbol, a walking embodiment of a particular kind of social tragedy. And it was this insight that led him to write his famous, devastating verdict. Thelma is proof that sometimes history is just a party to which you are not invited. Let's take a moment to truly unpack that sentence. On the surface, it is breathtakingly cruel, a witty, almost flippant dismissal of a life filled with profound love and pain. It reduces Thelma to a mere social climber who failed to make the final cut, and in that, it is deeply unfair. But beneath the cruelty lies a diamond-hard, uncomfortable truth. Capote understood better than anyone that history, like high society, is not a meritocracy. It is not about who is the most beautiful or the kindest or even the most loving. It is about power, timing, strategy, and sheer dumb luck. Thelma was beautiful, kind, and loving, but she was playing checkers in a world of three-dimensional chess. She believed in love, loyalty, and friendship. She faced Wallis Simpson, a woman who understood that in the great game of royal conquest, there are no rules. Thelma left the party voluntarily for a noble and selfless reason, to help her sister. When she tried to return, she found the locks had been changed, her seat had been taken, and a new guest of honor was being celebrated. Capote's line is the perfect, chilling metaphor for her life. She had a ticket, she was on the guest list, she even spent years inside dancing with the host, but she was never truly a member. Her invitation, she discovered too late, was revocable. So is Thelma Furness just a tragic, romantic footnote? A sad story of a lost love? Or is she something more? A deeper look at history suggests her role was far more pivotal than a mere personal tragedy. She may, in fact, be the single most important, unwitting catalyst of the abdication crisis. Consider the chain of events. If Gloria Vanderbilt had not been sued by her sister-in-law, Thelma would have had no reason to leave London. If Thelma had not left London, Wallis Simpson would likely never have had the sustained, intimate access to the prince that she needed to cement her hold over him. She would have remained an amusing but peripheral friend. If Wallis had not captured the prince, there would have been no constitutional crisis. Edward would have likely remained on the throne, perhaps eventually marrying a suitable aristocratic bride, or continuing his series of discreet affairs as his ancestors had done before him. If Edward VIII had remained king, the entire course of modern British history would be different. His younger, shy, stammering brother would never have become King George VI, and that brother's daughter, a young woman named Elizabeth, would have remained a minor princess, not the future Queen Elizabeth II. Furthermore, Edward's well-documented sympathies with Nazi Germany in the late 1930s could have had terrifying and unknowable consequences had he been on the throne at the outbreak of World War II. Thelma's journey to New York was a hinge of fate, a tiny personal decision that sent ripples across the century. She is a perfect example of the chaos theory of history, where the flutter of a butterfly's wings, or in this case, the boarding of an ocean liner, can set off a hurricane on the other side of the world. Her story is not a footnote to the abdication. It is arguably its inciting incident. She is the ghost in the machine of modern British history, the invisible hand that pushed the first crucial domino. Thelma Furness passed away in New York City on January 29, 1970. She was 65 years old. Her twin sister Gloria, her lifelong companion, died 5 years earlier. Thelma's death was noted in the papers, her obituary dutifully mentioning her famous affair with a king. She outlived the Duke of Windsor by 2 years and the Duchess by 16, a long time to reflect on the life that might have been. Was a woman of her time, a product of a world that valued beauty and ambition in women above all else? She played the game brilliantly, and she won the ultimate prize, only to discover that the rules could be changed without warning at any moment. Her life is a profound and unsettling meditation on the nature of fate and the ghosts of what if that haunt us all. Truman Capote was right. History was a party to which she was not ultimately invited. But her story, the story of the woman left standing on the doorstep, looking through the window at the dazzling life she was supposed to have, is infinitely more human, more relatable, and more tragically beautiful than the stories of many of the celebrated guests inside. It teaches us that the grand narratives of history are built upon a foundation of quiet, personal heartbreaks, and that sometimes the most significant life is not the one that is lived, but the one that is lost. In that loss, in her role as the eternal woman before, Thelma Furness found a strange, poignant, and everlasting place in the story she was never meant to finish.